In a world where Google, Apple, and even Microsoft control the vast majority of PCs on the market today, from low-power ultrabooks to ultra-high-power gaming PCs and anything in between, these corporate overlords control what you say, do, and see on the internet. But in comes a hero of open source and free ideals. Its name is Linux. And in today's video, I'll explain to you the year that I spent using Linux, on and off albeit, as my daily driver for content creation. Let's get into it. So that was actually a really fun intro to do. I mean, it's hard on my voice, good lord. It's a little hard on my voice, but dude, damn, that was fun to do. And you better like it, or else I'll come to your house and steal your cat, I suppose. But no, stealing your cat is not the topic of today's video. So it is no secret that people hate Microsoft, and there are people who hate Apple too. There's people on both camps, and both of them are frankly completely bonkers and that batshit crazy. You know, part of the language, but that's my opinion. And then you have this weird camp on the other end of the spectrum, like those Linux junkies, like, you know, the system administrators, the IT specialists, the guy that just hates both Apple and Microsoft and Google, if you're really into that kind of thing. And I tend to fall into that camp too. Like, I feel Windows is okay in the grand scheme of things. It's not great, it's not awful, it's okay. Apple macOS, okay, it's okay too in my opinion. I think it's one of the best looking operating systems you can get today anyway, but I still think it's okay. Can't emphasize that enough. So, around late 2019, mid 2020, I think it was just before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, at least in the United States, I bought this thing down here. Let me pick it up real quick. This is a laptop, obviously. If you couldn't tell it wasn't a laptop, I don't know what you're doing. You should probably get out of here because you're dumb. It is an Acer Nitro 5, what model number is it? AN51554. So it's very low end in terms of gaming laptops you can buy today. It has a Core i5 9000H, I think, and a GTX 1050 Max-Q. So you ain't gonna be playing 4K Fall Guys or something like that on this thing. Damn right that you're not going to. But that's not the reason why I bought it. I bought it to run Linux. Oh wait, I almost forgot. Yeah, so a part of the whole setup that I had going here was that I would have to use a Windows PC along with my Linux laptop to do part of my work. Now I would have OBS and streaming stuff going on the Windows PC, but I couldn't do it on the laptop because I didn't have an easy way to record or stream from a camera through a Camlink 4K. So I had to use a Windows PC. So to do that, it was actually pretty simple, actually. Not to hype things up or anything. I would just use a pretty standard 4 USB port QVM from StarTech. StarTech. And yeah, then I would just press this little button with this little remote, and then boom, I would switch computers. It really wasn't that difficult to figure it out, although for a long time before then I would just use 2 keyboards and 2 mice, which was horrifically bad for my setup, but it worked. So yeah, back to the video. And Linux, I have run on it for the last year since I bought it. I mean, I've bounced around to every imaginable distro I could ever think of while doing so, but I've done it. Now, this video is not going to be explaining it, telling you, hey, I use Linux for a year, whoop-de-doo. I'm going to give you my experiences with it, and just so if you want to move to Linux yourself for your own content creation, these are things you should be looking out for, because there's actually, despite it being a fantastic time, I've had a lot of fun using different Linux distributions across a whole wide range of bases. There were problems, and some were deal-breaking. So today in this video, let's go over my experiences with using Linux, everything, so like down to the bare bones, and kind of give you this rundown of should you switch to it for your daily driver and content creation yourself. And it should be mentioned before we get to the intro, or if I haven't done already, it should be mentioned, don't take everything as I say as hearsay, because while Linux is growing in the desktop market very quickly, it's actually gained a significant amount of ground over macOS, Windows, and Chrome OS in just the last couple of years alone. It's not a perfect solution. It is not the best solution. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, and let's begin. So let's just start off with the distributions I've used over the years. And I've used many. I've used Manjaro, I've used Ubuntu, I've used Solus, I've used OpenSUSE. What other ones I've found? I've even used some versions of Arch as well, and other Debian derivatives. So I've used a lot of stuff, and I really can't say for certain exactly, what. I already can't say for certain exactly what is the right distribution for you. Really, if you're looking for a distribution for content creation, find one that has, at least in their own software repositories, the software that you need. Now, with the advent of things like Snapcraft and Flatpak, universal packages are becoming more widespread, especially with Flatpak. It's been growing immensely over the last couple of years, and I'm happy to see the progress it has made. Not a perfect solution, and number of limited distributions on Flatpak exclusively are limited. Now, if you're going to get universal packages, I would highly recommend you use Snapcraft or something that supports Snapcraft, because the number of distributions it supports is miles longer than Flatpak. But that's not the whole story here. Let me get back on track. The software that I tend to use with content creation on Linux is limited compared to Windows or Mac OS, obviously. And there's no Adobe Suite. You don't have the Affinity Suite, the Vegas Suite. I mean, good Lord. They're never going to port that into any other Windows, and they're hurting for it. Now, the software that I tend to use for graphic design has historically been Krita. No surprise there. It's a very capable program on its own and a very competent alternative to Photoshop and to some extent Adobe Designer and InDesign. It's incredible the things it can do for being a free open source program, and it's getting better all the time. So, but there are problems with it that I have noticed. In older versions of the program, especially when I first started out doing this whole experiment with using Linux during this last year, is that Gmike, Gracie's Magic for Image Computer, if you're not familiar with it, Gmike was not included with it by default during a couple iterations of the program in the last year. Some versions of the program included it, others omitted it. I don't know what was the reason for that. I'm not sure why they kept bouncing around, flip-flopping between including Gmike in the install and excluding it. KDE has always made weird decisions with their stuff, so I don't know. So for right now, at least as it stands right now, Krita doesn't include Gmike, but that's not really pertinent to this discussion. The other problems I've been having, especially as of recently, with the updates of the GNOME stack to version 40, is fonts. Now, Krita and KDE programs in general have always had a problem using OFL or TrueType fonts. And if you're not familiar, if you don't have no idea what I'm talking about, let me explain very briefly what I mean. So when you get a font or font face or anything kind of font off of the internet or in the store or whatever, it's going to come into a file that's like OFL or TrueType. That's usually the two most common versions of font files. Now, pretty much any operating system you can think of could theoretically have a font manager that will install it in one click. The GNOME stack does have it, and in the past it's worked just perfectly fine. You open up a TrueType font or OFL font, the button's right there at the top, click it and it installs, and you have it in all the programs that use fonts are able to access the database for them and use them as they need to. But with the update to GNOME 40, that's a different story. The update to GNOME 40 has seen that button or something going wrong in the back end isn't working right. So you click the button, it'll say installing for a second, then just go back to saying install again, and the font wasn't installed. I would click it multiple times over and over again. Eventually, it would just get stuck in the process and nothing would happen. Now, when I use Farron OS fairly recently, because Farron OS is desktop environments based on KDE Plasma, which is in of itself not even based on a whole lot of GNOME to begin with, it worked better because it was just able to install it perfectly and it's ready to use. But anything that used the GNOME 40 stack, or at least 3.38, it just didn't work. And Krita was no exception to this. So that was the biggest issue I think I've had in the last year using Linux, is that fonts have always been a finicky thing for me because the program that I was using, Krita, wasn't really capable of reading fonts too accurately to be able to use them. Then there was the problem, Krita does not offer everything that I absolutely need to get everything done, so I had to resort to other programs, which I'm going to talk about here next. The other programs I use for graphic design. Now, I've used a couple, and one of the, I think probably the best I've used, weirdly, is an off-brand software called Gravit Designer. Now, this is a weird one. This is a weird one because it goes against, at least in their business model, the Linux ethos, where there's a free version. It's not open source. And the free version is limited. Now in normal circles that would be seen as okay, but in Linux, not so much. That's kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit amongst the community. So as a result, I only used it very briefly, where I moved over to another program called Inkscape. Now, if you're really hip to like old school, content creation like 10 years ago, you'll be very familiar with Inkscape. And it's funny because Inkscape was actually just brought out of alpha like 7 or 8 months ago. I think it was like mid to late last year when it finally came out of alpha and released their first official version. It's weird how it's been in alpha since 2004. It was really weird, but Inkscape I found to be kind of finicky. It doesn't really work the way that I want it to. Now, this is kind of a common running trend with open source software, is that the people who are designing the software really don't understand the concept of KISS. Now, if you're not familiar up to speed with KISS, it just means keep it stupid simple or keep it simple stupid. It is the kind of the defining, the biggest, I guess you could say, the principle on designing anything, whether it be graphic, motion, or even software design. You need to keep your software, whatever you're designing, simple. Just completely simple. It doesn't have to be super complex, so that the people using it are able to pick it up without much of a problem. Now, if you're designing a piece of software for, say, like a CNC machine, like if you're designing something for that, KISS may not necessarily apply. But when it comes to software you're using for, say, like content creation, it certainly does apply, because that means the people who are going to use it probably don't have a whole lot of experience with open source software to begin with, and they're just looking for something free alternative, because a lot of stuff that's available on Linux is also available on macOS and Windows. So there's that. So the last couple of programs I use, because I used a ton of programs apparently in the last year, is GIMP and Glimpse. Now, GIMP and Glimpse are basically the exact same program. Like their basic code is basically the exact same thing. It's basically, or Glimpse is basically GIMP, but more simplified. Now, if you're kind of the kind of person who likes to do power tool, like really heavy duty power tools, you're probably going to be using GIMP over Glimpse because it offers the better tools. But Glimpse I found to be easier to use and better faster workflows because of it, so I tend to use that a little bit more. It also ran better because of its a more simplified code base. They had problems too. Now, I would initially use Glimpse to bring in photos that I would take with my camera here, my Nikon D3400, that I would usually take for thumbnails. And the NEF RAW files that it produces, because I always shoot in RAW. The NEF files it produces, I guess, were pretty too big for the program to handle, to kind of cut out the image of my face and then copy and paste it into another program. Because every time I would do that, it would crash. Like Glimpse would crash, but the program I was copying it into would not. It was really weird. I'm not sure if it was a problem with the Linux headers, because I've heard that was kind of a thing with the Linux headers at the time. Haven't tried it since. So that was a pretty big problem, and I ended up not stopping using it until Krita got updated a little recently to 3.3.4, the magnetic selection tool, and I have a video coming up on that somewhat soon on tips and tricks for Krita, so you're gonna want to hear about that, because I talk about the magnetic selection tool in that video. Stay subscribed for that. Anyway, once that tool was included into the program, I made my switch over to using Krita, and it worked so much better. Like, Krita was able to handle everything I threw at it. So that was kind of the thing. That was kind of the software I used for graphic design. Now, what did I use for audio? Well, audio has always been a misfit for me, because you had pretty much two programs on Linux. You had Ardour, which is like super high-end professional digital audio workstation. Then you had Audacity. Now, I know Audacity is getting a lot of flack these days for their terms of service that it just updated. But when I used it, it was before these even had the new owner to begin with. I found it to be problematic because I don't know, the audio interface is this one behind me right here. This is a Focusrite Scarlett 2i2 first gen. No, it's a fantastic audio interface. It's actually given to me by a friend, believe it or not. I didn't pay a single thing for this thing, so I'm not sure what I was expecting from that. But all the same, it wouldn't work on Audacity. And let me explain. Here. So the problem I was having was it wouldn't be detectable by Audacity. Like, it just wouldn't show up. Like the drivers for sound on Linux wouldn't pick it up. But my Behringer Euphoria UMC 22, you can barely see it. It's kind of out of focus. Let me give it a better focus. Never mind. Yeah, that's a bit of a thing. Anyway, the Behringer Euphoria UMC 22. It was able to be detectable by the drivers in Linux, and for some reason the Scarlett 2i2, it just wouldn't. So that was kind of the biggest problem, and I ended up just using the program running behind me. There we go. Acid 8, or just Sony Acid 8, at least at the time. That's the program that I use these days for recording my audio. It works just fine. Using the interface that I'm using right now, it separates both the left and right channels automatically, whereas with a Focusrite, it'll only record to one channel. I want it in stereo like 100% of the time. I don't want to finicky with it, so I used Acid. That was another thing that Audacity I had a problem with, was that in Audacity, it would no matter what interface I used, it would always record to a single channel. I had to use this really weird hack to split the audio into two. And I could never really remember off the top of my head every single time I had to do it, how to do it, because it was so convoluted. So I ended up just, again, moving to Acid. Not the drug Acid, you know, the program. You know what, never mind. So that was kind of the thing that I had with software, or not software, or audio software rather. Now, what did I use for video editing? Well, this is even bigger L for me, because I was even more limited to what I could use when it comes to video editing. Now, it's largely dependent on the distribution I was using at the time, but the most important would be Ubuntu, at least nowadays, because Ubuntu or DaVinci Resolve rather, is supported on Ubuntu. Even that came with caveats. Like, every time I think about this, it completely blows my mind the reason why Blackmagic Design thought that doing it this way was a good way to do it. Unlike the macOS and Windows versions of DaVinci Resolve, on Linux, if you are using the free version of the program, it does not support importing MP4 files that are encoded with H.264 encoding. Why? Why? Seriously. Why, Blackmagic? Why? What was the point of that move? Is it because that on Linux, it's huge with visual motion graphics and the VFX industry? Is that the reason why? Is that? What about Windows and Mac OS? People on Windows and Mac OS are part of the VFX industry too. What was the point of making the free version of DaVinci Resolve on Linux specifically unsupported for H.264? What was the point of that? Every time I think about that, it pisses me off, because it would have been the perfect solution to this whole problem, an all-in-one solution. I would have editing, I would have color grading, I would have audio, I would have visual effects and motion graphics. I would have everything at my tooltips and still be able to use Linux as my data driver if I could just import MP4s. And some people might be saying, "Oh, you know what you could do? You know what you could do? Just buy the damn program." I don't want to buy the program. I want to use the free version. It's my money. I want to do whatever that damn will do with it. If I want to buy the program, I'll buy it, but I'm not inclined to right now. I'd rather use something free. So that leads me to another program I was using, Kdenlive. Now, if you're very hip to the KDE ecosystem, you'd be very familiar with the Kdenlive program. It's okay. It's got professional tools, at least for open source software. The only problem is that it's horrifically unstable. Because if you're not hip to KDE programs, they're notorious for having a lot of bloat. Very much more bloat than the competition. Now, that's gotten better over the years, but still not where it needs to be, because every time I import footage from this camera, it crashes because it can't process them. So that leads me to the last program, the last ditch effort to using Linux as my daily driver, Olive. Now, I made a video on Olive before. It's coming along. It's coming along. It's not there yet. It's still very much an early alpha program. But weirdly, it's more stable than Kdenlive at this point in its development. Now, the thing about Olive is that there's two versions of it right now. There's the 0.1 alpha, and there's the 0.2. The 0.1 version of the alpha, again, is still more stable than Kdenlive, but offers significantly less because, it's alpha. So that's kind of the big problem with using it, because I could use Kdenlive and have to deal with a horrifically unstable program, or I use Olive that will give me the basic tools that I need anyway, and that's it. And I ended up choosing Olive because some of those tools that Kdenlive offered, I didn't really need in my own normal workflow. So yeah, that was a fun ride for the last year. I mean, to be honest with you, it wasn't completely a loss because things are getting better. With the advent of Proton, with Steam on Linux, and gaming on Linux in general is becoming so much better, getting the things that I need to get done have become much more viable in the last couple of years than it ever has been. And I'm pretty happy to see the progress that Linux as an ecosystem has been making, because, like that skit I did at the beginning of the video, it's amazing to see these large companies control the entirety, almost, of the technology spectrum we see today with computers and phones and tablets and laptops, and I mean, even this monitor I'm looking at right here, even that is probably running some form of Unix, and macOS is based on Unix if it's not running Linux to begin with. So I'd like to see Linux make more progress. I like to see Linus Torvalds, the kind of big head honcho at the Linux Foundation, really make a push for the content creator, because I think in retrospect, there is potential here. I think there is a path forward for the Linux ecosystem, for the good little penguin that it is, to see where it could go for the average user. I mean, only time will tell. Because maybe once Windows 11 is out and people realize, I can't run it because I have this specific setting in my BIOS not turned on, or I didn't even have it to begin with, they may turn to Linux. Because Linux will run on anything, regardless of BIOS settings. So there is hope. There is hope on the horizon. I'm excited to see where it goes. And that's the end of my story. If you like this video, then consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. And if you dislike the video, well, whatever you do, it does help me, so thank you. You would also like to join a larger community at hand. We do have a Discord server, the Aspergian Empire. If you'd like to chat some more, or we'd like to ask me 4 more questions, or have something unanswered that you'd like to be answered that I didn't say in this video, then drop us a comment down below, or just join the Discord server. And if you'd like to hear more updates of the channel, be sure to follow my Twitter page. And I guess follow my Twitch page if I'm if I'm ever gonna stream there again. I'm not entirely sure at this point. So yeah, thank you for joining this video, everyone. I'll see you guys in the next one. I'll see you later. Woo! Yeah, baby. Did it. Woohoo! I love it.